Good to see everybody back here. It's always a pleasure to get together with Club. I know Evans Poston always talked about the Virginia Club as being the best deal in town. I don't know if he was talking about the money or the company, but he was right either way. I appreciate having the chance to come and speak to you probably about 14, 15 months after you all hosted a candidate forum during the Democratic primary, where you got to hear a little bit about what my policies were you to entrust me with public safety in the city and what some of the other policies and philosophies were. Since taking office January 1st, I've had the privilege of putting some of those policies into place to try and make sure that we prioritize safety while at the same time making sure that we are fair to everybody who comes through the system, whether it's the accused, victims, witnesses, or law enforcement professionals, and while husbanding our public resources, and while finally dealing with a problem that has been front of mind for prosecutors nationwide, regardless of political affiliation, which is the recognition that over the last few years all of us have seen, which is that there is a crisis in trust in the justice system, both right and left, in whether the brand of justice you get is truly based on the facts of the case, or whether it's based on who your mom and dad are, what your race is, what your income is, or some other access that may mean that you get one brand of concierge justice and other people don't. I know the specific topic that we want to talk about, and I want to make sure I leave time for questions about it, is what is going on in Norfolk, and why are we seeing such an increase in violence here in Norfolk, and what is the city doing, and what independently am I doing to try and address those things. To give you a Norfolk-specific answer, I need to zoom out to a national and arguably global level, and then zoom back in. The levels of crime, and specifically violent crime, that we saw in as recently as 5 or 6 years ago were historically unprecedented. We went from a position where in the early 1990s, 13% plus of all homicides in the United States happened either in New York or in Los Angeles. And where murder numbers were consistently higher than they are even today. We saw a decline where there were a lot of correlatory factors, but not completely clear causative factors that led to things like the lowest rate of homicides in New York City since the early 1960s. We were the beneficiaries of that here in Norfolk as much as anybody else was. We saw as few as 36 or 35 murders as recently as 7, 8, 9 years ago. That was a falling tide of violence that lowered all boats to where we wanted it to be. But it was also still reflective that in absolute numbers, Norfolk had the second most homicides in the Commonwealth of Virginia decade after decade, behind Richmond. Richmond with 20% or so less population, though they're consistently catching up to us, and with pretty consistently 20% more homicides. There began to be a somewhat upward trend in violence nationwide, coming into about 2018 or 2019, and then a sharp uptick in 2020 and 2021, with what appears from FBI data to reflect a small decrease nationally in 2022. The discussion and the public narrative, which unfortunately can, with good intentions, wind up being relatively reductive, was that there has been an explosion in crime. Crime is a larger is a sort of a bucket, a catch-all category, and it doesn't actually reflect what's going on. And it's why I consistently, when speaking to members of the public, members of the press, and groups like this, I want to focus on the fact that what we have seen is actually an increase in violence. Now, that is obviously the most important and most alarming element of crime, but it is not crime in general. By way of example, the data that we see from the Virginia State Police that compiles incident-based reports, that is, calls made to police departments and police agencies throughout the Commonwealth. So it doesn't count arrests, it doesn't count prosecutions, simply reports reflected sharp upticks around the Commonwealth in homicides and in some other crimes that I'll get into, but showed a relatively sharp decrease in burglaries, for example. And one that, by the way, reflects here in Norfolk. I had a question from indirectly from a judge asking if my office had decided that burglars should be convicted of misdemeanors, and that's why burglars weren't going to circuit court. And I expressed my personal antipathy towards the crime of burglary and confirmed with the police department that Norfolk, over the last 2 years, has seen a 35 to 40% decrease in residential burglaries. If that seems counterintuitive to you, compared to our alarming and significant increase in homicides, let us reflect on what happened in March of 2020. As of approximately March 16th of that year, we all became guinea pigs in the world's largest social experiment in 100 years, which was the lockdown and COVID-related restrictions and dislocations in Virginia, nationwide, and worldwide that are causing unintended consequences throughout human society. What we saw here in the United States was, in specific to the work that I do, which is the prosecution of criminal offenses. We saw a removal of a number of different guardrails that had either contributed to or allowed the control of the rate of violence that will run at some form of baseline no matter what we do. Those factors included the closure of schools, the closure of most places of work, the increase in social and economic insecurity throughout all classes of society, the general baseline anxiety that came from either the concern about COVID or the concern about the restrictions over COVID, the removal of avenues of escape for potential victims. All of those things contributed to an explosion of violence everywhere. We saw, according to FBI data, that the largest increases in violence in the United States happened in cities of between 25 and either 75 or 100,000 residents. We saw the largest increases in homicides in percentage terms from obviously low absolute levels in Wyoming and South Dakota. We saw the point where, as I mentioned, in the early 1990s, 13% and change of all homicides of the United States happened in 2 cities. That current figure is 4%. So we saw red states, blue states, big cities, small towns, everywhere, seeing an increase in violence. To break those factors down further, one of the great drivers of violence is economic insecurity. Another major driver of violence is psychological pressure. Another major driver of violence is the inability of young people, the 15 to 25-year-old demographic, who drives a lot of the violence and a lot of what I'd consider to be the senseless violence. The lack of constructive outlets for them to express their teenaged impulses that we have all had. And again, specifically in the domestic violence and intimate partner violence world, the fact that we locked up victims at home with their abusers with basically no way to get out. So we have seen, again, red state, blue state, progressive prosecutors like me, lock-em-up prosecutors in the mold of the early 1990s. Police departments that believe in community trust and police departments that believe in 1990s tactics, all contending with these issues. And as we see repeatedly in the newspapers, we keep seeing that COVID lockdown was basically like chemotherapy. We were gravely ill. The medicine that we took, we were experimenting on ourselves, and in some ways, the side effects may or may not have been worse than the disease. We will only know in time. But top of the fold this morning in the Virginian pilot was an explosion in maternal mortality. during COVID. It is just one of a number of things. Here in Norfolk, unfortunately, the news is worse. We are on pace this year to surpass Richmond's homicide numbers. I don't think that has happened in memory, and I can say that having practiced in Richmond. And it is of particular concern to me, because those of you who remember my coming to speak in this forum last year remember my saying that part of my goal as a prosecutor with limited resources was to direct my resources at violent crime and at the suppression and punishment of violent crime without grabbing up in a dragnet everybody who has committed any crime whatsoever and over-punishing and wasting our resources as taxpayers, as lawyers, or as police officers on low-level offenses. One of the other major factors that we have to recognize here in the city of Norfolk is that the great resignation of various parts of the private and the public sector has hit us particularly hard here in Norfolk. Some combination of the civil rights protests of 2020, COVID, and the availability of jobs and inflation led to an arms race over the last few years, which any of us who've grown up in Tidewater are familiar with, where our wealthier sister cities around us began to take our municipal workers. There was, again, a departure from law enforcement and from police departments that hit everybody in the South Side and nationwide relatively hard. And a lot of our police officers made the rational decision to take more money and work less and go out to Virginia Beach, go out to Chesapeake. I don't know what the exact numbers are now, but well over 50, probably closer to 100 if I had to guess, of our Norfolk officers are in one of those two, or in each of those jurisdictions. The city government has attempted to address that by increasing pay and offering ways to try and retain officers. But the fact is, on a department where we were looking at roughly 700 officers sworn, we're probably in the neighborhood of 400 right now. And I can attest, having taken a page out of both Richmond and Chesapeake's book, and having gone to practically every homicide scene since late January to make myself available as a legal resource, the officers that we have are incredibly, massively overachieving. They are overachieving because they are being pushed past their psychological breaking point and past what's physically possible. Mandatory extra shifts, work where our city that's divided into 6 police sectors will have roughly 42 officers in cars at any point, with some sectors being down to as few as 2 or 3 officers a shift, where the entire homicide bureau consists of 2 sergeants and 5 detectives for 61 homicides last year and 53 and counting this year. I explained to people relatively bluntly that the situation that we are in should be far worse. It should be worse because it is a simple matter of manpower. You cannot ask 400 men and women to do 700 men and women's jobs. And the police department is actually doing a remarkably and laudatorily good job with the people they've got. But the results start to accumulate. And that gets to what my role is in the system. I'm an independently elected official. I don't control my budget. Some combination of Richmond and Norfolk control my budget. 35% Richmond, 40% Norfolk, 20% my chief deputy, who has been an absolute bloodhound for grant money. I don't control the community's decision to come forward and provide information to the police to help them have the clearance rates that we need. The police can't arrest the people they can't identify. I don't control the willingness of witnesses to come to court. I can't convict people without witnesses. The Constitution says that no matter what kind of police reports or statements I have in my file, real live people have to come to court. I can control what arguments we make in court, what cases we triage, and are used to free up resources for our more serious cases. And I can have the lawyers on staff to make the best arguments that we can to convince judges and jurors to convict beyond a reasonable doubt, knowing that their instruction is that any reasonable theory of innocence requires an acquittal. Any reasonable theory of innocence. So I am one piece in the chain. I'm not the last link, I'm not the first link. But what I have done in my office is to laser focus on violence, laser focus on weapons, tighten up our plea policies when it came to weapons cases that, in my opinion, had been lax. Being a progressive prosecutor, which I am, requires tightening certain restrictions while loosening others based on both data and experience, and making sure that we don't replicate the mistakes of the 1990s. The mistakes of the 1990s were when serious high-level offenders didn't get caught. Or got caught at the rates they were going to get caught and got their heavy sentences, like the multi-decade sentences that, if you watch our press releases from my office, we seek on a regular basis and secure. But it was to capture low-level offenders. And the federal court, and I'll close with this so that we have time for questions, the instructions that our federal judges get when they weigh the appropriate sentence to impose, I've memorialized in a plea agreement philosophy and policy that my lawyers have to read. It's close to 11 single-space pages, and that in a nod to the Justice Department's policies I've published on my website and shared with the judges here. And the federal requirement for judges is to impose a sentence sufficient but no greater than necessary. Sufficient but no greater than necessary to vindicate the public interest. And that is what I and we continue to do. If somebody deserves life, I'm going to seek life, providing that I have the witnesses, I have the report, and I have the ability to go forward. If the appropriate sentence is a suspended sentence or diversion, that is what I will seek. If the appropriate sentence is a year, that is what I will seek, with those strictures in mind. Because somebody should serve every day or every month or every year that they deserve, but no more. Because the minute that you go over what somebody is supposed to serve, you are doing an injustice to them. You are wasting our dollars to the tune of $30,000 to $50,000 a year to jail them. You're taking them off of the payroll, whether formal or informal, and you're taking on the financial burden of raising their children. And we saw how that worked out in the 1990s. It worked out extraordinarily poorly. And in a time of increasing tough on crime and get tough rhetoric, we have to remember first not to write checks that our rear ends can't cash. And the second is to make sure that we don't inadvertently make examples of people for the sake of feeling safer while at the same time making ourselves less safe. So one last thing, if you'll permit. We're going to see more vacancies over the course of the next year. So be prepared. The police department is doing some extraordinary things to hold the line and to recruit. I spoke to a recruit class at the academy of 20 students last month. They're going to keep working on it, but we are not going to see an overnight improvement. The city council is doing what they can do, the judges, me, the police department, but it's going to take some time. And if there were an easy button to press for any of these things, everybody would have mashed it with their fists by now. But it's a multi-factor problem that we didn't intend to have, and that we're all going to work together to try and solve. Questions?
Yeah, I have a question. You talked about unsandy cars. Thank you for your presentation, very illuminating. One thing that you brought up, which I'm reading about, is the disparity in pay between Virginia Beach and Chesapeake. We as a city, we can't do too much about that. So given the fact that we as a city can't do too much about it, how can we get that solved? I heard foundation support. That was interesting to me. I'd like to know more about that. But two, shouldn't that be done at the state level? Can we get some sort of mandate where we get some equalization of pay? If not so, should we force our civic leaders to talk about merging these departments, merging the fire department, merging the police departments? I'm from New York. You have five counties, Brooklyn, you know where they are, Brooklyn, Manhattan. Guess what? You all work for the New York Police Department. In Long Island, where I was raised, the county wasn't a town. The county sent the police department. So my concern is this division between, I'm not from here, I know the history, but it gets me hot. It's a regional problem. The in turn, Norfolk is carrying more than its share of the murder rates. It's killing downtown. People do not. My staff, my company has 30 people working for us. You don't want to go. You don't want to walk out. You don't even want to go to the mall right now because of the headlines. So my question, the answer is more police. As you said, we're short by 300. You mentioned one thing. We all know what's going on within the police, but the one thing we can control is the pay. And Mike, to me, losing good policemen to Virginia Beach gets me hot. What can we do to get some cooperation between our cities? If we can't do it, should we take it up to another level? Should we have groundswell to make something happen in that regard? That's my question.
Great question. And to repeat for everybody watching virtually, the question is, can we get regional cooperation with our sister cities, Virginia Beach, for example, in trying to address the pay disparities or the poaching problems that we're seeing from the police department, which, by the way, my office hasn't been immune from either. Or is this a Richmond solution, or is it a regional consolidation solution? I wish I could give you a good answer, but it requires going way back to the annexation wars of the 1960s and the creation of the cities of Virginia Beach and Chesapeake and Suffolk. I'm not here to. I grew up in Virginia Beach. I'm not here to diss any other cities, but the fact is that we have seen over and over again over the course of the decades that there's a lot of talk about regionalism, but when the rubber starts to meet the road and when there's a zero-sum game afoot, that every city goes their own way. There is partly a federal and partly a state solution. In fact, the Biden administration is currently pushing I don't want to get the number wrong, but a very large number appropriation to incentivize police pay raises and police retention. And some of that money, should it pass the House and Senate and not be blocked for political reasons, should filter down to Richmond and then hopefully filter down to Norfolk. But the pay and other requirements for local workers winds up really in the locality's hands. I can't speak exactly to how it works for the police. I think that it's as it is with prosecutors, a mix of state and local money. And what happens is the state can set a floor, both in terms of head count and in terms of salary, and then localities have the option to supplement that pay. I can tell you would I like to see a merger of the 5 South Side cities into a mega city to try and solve these problems? Absolutely. I think that's the fair thing to do. Though, do I think that it is ever going to happen? I think that I will sprout wings and fly before it happens. I just don't think it will ever happen. If on a side note, the way that we see that play out as prosecutors is the same as with the police department. Norfolk, for example, has always been the big leagues. We are the big leagues. We have high-quality prosecutors. We train them up. We get good results in court. The kind of cases. We had 4 simultaneous felony jury trials going a couple of weeks ago, including 2 homicides going simultaneously, and the other being the serial rapist who was drugging and killing his victims. Those are being tried by my backbone in my office, which is my mid and upper level line prosecutors. Any one of those cases that had been going a couple of weeks ago would have been the case of the year in lesser jurisdictions. So my people, they know how to do these cases. And in fact, I credit my prosecution philosophy for allowing me to poach some very serious people to come down here to do this kind of work. I have 3 deputy Commonwealth's attorneys. I align my office, by the way, along the lines of the police precincts here to optimize intelligence sharing so that if we catch Al Capone evading taxes, we can put him in prison for that. If we have a murderer who has intimidated his witnesses and we've had to dismiss the case, if we catch him on a felony elude or grand larceny or something like that, the idea is to try and extract the maximum penalty possible out of those cases through good intelligence sharing. Out of those three, one has been a lawyer nearly 30 years and has been up for a judgeship more than once. The second is a former Norfolk Circuit Court judge whom I poached from the city of Chesapeake. And the third is Mark Herring's Deputy Attorney General for Public Safety, who sold his house in Richmond and moved down here and was my former colleague as a public defender 15 years ago in Richmond, and brought with him another guy who sold his house and moved down to Norfolk and has tried 90 juries. So, but on the lower level, consistently, I will lose good 2, 3, 4, 5-year prosecutors who will go and get $10, $15, $20, $25,000 a year more to work in Suffolk, to work in Chesapeake, to work in Virginia Beach, and work a fraction of the amount of time they need to do the work we do here.
I have a quick follow-up, and I'll be quiet. My follow-up is the public sector, it's going to take a long time. Okay? My grandchildren might see a merger. Okay? However, can the private sector fill the gap right now? If a foundation was created, if a body of some money was put aside, specifically for the salaries of the police department and your department, has there been a local precedent for that in other cities?
Not that I know of. And I know that the only thing that resembles it at all is the Virginia property and casualty insurance industry. They got tired of having their insurance fraud cases at the bottom of the pile for prosecutors and for investigators, and about 25 years ago, they created a special tax that went into a lockbox that led to the creation of the Virginia State Police Insurance Fraud Investigators Force, which we in Louisiana are the only 2 states in the Union that have that group. And then they got tired of having prosecutors go, well, if it doesn't bleed, it must not be a crime, which as a former white-collar prosecutor, I always found deeply objectionable. I still have a strong interest and have actually put some tightening rules in place for prosecuting white-collar crime in Norfolk. But they wound up using that income stream, because their lockbox was running surplus, to create specific multi-jurisdictional insurance fraud prosecutors, of which I was one of the inaugural ones. They expanded that program from 2 to 5 within recent years. But to have straight-up private sector contributions, I think, may create both legal ethics problems and practical problems. The best solution is a Richmond solution. So, and if you'll forgive, there were 2 things: first, for your downtown employees, and second, for what can you really do. One of the things that drives me absolutely crazy, both as a public safety guy and as a fairness and equity guy, is the fact that Virginia has always done government on the cheap and has done public safety on the cheap. And the main way that impacts me as Norfolk Commonwealth's attorney is that under the Virginia Code, and this is something you can do because you can lobby with this, and you should lobby your state legislators about this, both Republican and Democratic. The Virginia State Code says that prosecutors must prosecute felonies and may, in their discretion, prosecute misdemeanors. Felonies being punishable by up to life, misdemeanors, the cap for theoretical punishment is a year. And theoretically, their felonies are serious and misdemeanors aren't. But things like domestic assault, DUI, trespassing, sexual battery, stalking, all of those crimes are misdemeanors. The simple possession of your cousin's $10 of Adderall without a prescription is a felony that carries up to 10 years in prison. So the must prosecute felonies, may prosecute misdemeanors line produces the real-world effect that the General Assembly says that they will pay for prosecutors to prosecute felonies, but since it is our choice to prosecute misdemeanors, including, again, larcenies from cars, graffiti on your buildings, all of those things, they say, well, since you don't have to do it, figure out how to do it. And that then falls to localities, either to provide extra prosecutors. I get a DUI prosecutor here in Norfolk. Now, up till about 10 years ago, Virginia Beach had their DUI cases, with the absolute most by raw numbers DUIs in the entire Commonwealth. The police officer had to go in there and go up against a $5,000 retainer defense lawyer with no prosecutor. And basically, like, he and the judge had to informally tag team and like be prosecutors. Um, so every DUI case that I prosecute in Norfolk is with city money. The 2 domestic assault prosecutors that I have are from money from the Justice Department, because the General Assembly doesn't think it's important enough that if somebody assaults their spouse or their girlfriend to put a prosecutor in there. Every larceny from a car, there is no prosecutor in there. And it's not just Norfolk, it's Chesapeake, it's Virginia Beach, because the General Assembly doesn't think it's important enough. And as a prosecutor, that drives me absolutely wild, because both from a public safety point of view, where I want to touch people when they've committed the misdemeanor to figure out if they're on their way to being felons, or where I want to touch it because the person's mentally ill and needs to be diverted, or requires some sort of disposition, as a high school kid who needs another chance, I'm literally not there because I have to steal resources from felons when I had 61 homicides last year. For your downtown people, let me put a request that I gave to the Greater Norfolk Corporation. Cameras, 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 cameras. As private sector people, please install high-quality audio and video camera systems and make them available to the police. A significant number of the cases that the Norfolk police have been able to break over the last few months have been with cameras. And some of the most high-profile cases that you're wondering what on earth is going on and why are the cases terrible or why has there not been an arrest, cameras, or the lack thereof, play a part in it. A web of private sector cameras available with audio and video may or may not capture the crime itself. But even if it doesn't, first of all, it deters, because people, there are some people you just can't deter. And the police chief said that a few weeks ago. But anybody who's actually thinking about what they're doing, if they see a camera, they're less likely to do something. But I can give you an example. There was a high-profile homicide that happened outside of downtown. One other thing, by the way, to remind your employees, 3% of shootings in Norfolk have happened downtown over the last few years. 3%. The other 97% are in the neighborhoods and elsewhere, and in the same places where the Federal Housing Administration, for example, refused to insure mortgages based on having a certain, being over a certain target of black residents, among other things. So cameras is what I would recommend for them. The high-profile case, the camera didn't capture what happened on the residential street, but the camera in the parking lot of an auto parts store captured the 2 defendants, one of whom is now dead, and the other one was at large. Well, he was dead as of the night of the offense, but the other one who was at large, the police were able to identify and arrest based on the quality of the camera system in an auto parts store that had nothing to do with the crime other than happening to be on the path of travel of the defendant. So I could take up another half hour of what I'm doing in Richmond lobbying for cameras and facial recognition technology, but I want to give a chance for other people to have questions.
How prevalent is gang activity to the rise of crime?
Questions, how prevalent is gang activity to the rise of crime? Depends on how you define gangs. If you're talking about gangs like we see in the movies where there's a command structure and they're reporting to their bosses in Los Angeles and New York City, not much. Gary's office, the U.S. Attorney's office, where, by the way, I have posted one of my best lawyers to make sure that we have the reach of the federal government to touch major gang cases like that, major homicides, chains of robberies. Those cases, there's a little, but what's really driving the violence, and it's not just violence, it's road rage, triple-digit driving, all of that is the disinhibition, and it's young people. So the gangs that we see are really small g gangs. They are teenagers, usually neighborhood-based, 15 to 25. One of the great innovations in criminology over the last 15 to 20 years is recognizing that development of the prefrontal cortex is one of the main things that helps reduce crime. Our brain doesn't really come fully online until about the age of 25. And so when you're dealing with the 15 to 25-year-olds, they legally may be 18 adults, but they're not thinking like we do. So a lot of it is people from, let's say, Calvert Square and Young's Terrace, who live right next to each other, but they will go on social media and insult each other. So you did this, you're a clown, this and that, whatever. And then when they encounter each other, whether that be on Granby Street or driving down Little Creek Road or wherever you have it, they'll gunfire erupts, and they resort to guns, which are unfortunately, I think the last count is that there are 400 million in circulation in the U.S. One of the other COVID effects was the ATF measures background checks by month, and the background checks aren't a complete measure of number of gun sales, but they're a good proxy. And a number of record months for gun sales happened during COVID. So these kids, they'll go out, up yours, no up yours, and your mom too, and then they'll go down 2 or 3 lines of cars, break into the cars. Somebody will have not secured a gun. So they'll go out, they'll have a gun, and then when they encounter each other, it escalates. So it's not the kind of thing where we can have some sort of decapitation strike, where we can grab a gang kingpin and all of a sudden there will be a huge drop in violence. This is sort of like people joining the Elks, except with a propensity for violence, and it's decentralized. So they are there, they are operating, but they are not. It's not the kind of thing where a 20 defendant federal indictment on federal criminal RICO is all of a sudden going to do it in. So that's why, even though it gets certain people don't take seriously the requests from the community for extended library hours and extended recreational center hours for literal midnight basketball, the Norfolk Nighthawks program that's been operating over this summer. All of those things I hear from community leaders who talk both to me and to hardened criminals, that those things will have a medium to long-term effect. Not necessarily because today's late teenager carrying a gun may or may not go to that basketball game, but because you're grabbing and offering alternatives and healthier outlets for the 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds, so that they don't join the neighborhood group that produces this kind of tit-for-tat, retaliatory, totally meaningless and difficult to deter violence.
Question, please. Sheriff Barron was interviewed recently, and he disclosed that the current population of the Norfolk jail is fewer than 600, and he said that a decade ago it was about 1,400. If we're having a historic spike in violent crime, why is the population of the jail at a historic low? And do your policies having to do with jail have a bearing on that?
Right. Excellent question, Glenn. For everybody watching at home, Glenn's question was that Joe Barron was here, the sheriff, and said that his jail population is at a historic low. Are my policies to contribute to that? If we're seeing an increase in violence, why are we seeing a decrease in the jail population? We'll zoom out and then zoom back in. The short answers are fewer incidents being reported over the last few years, a change in the bail statutes over which I have very little to no control, and in a word, no. My policies aren't driving it. And I'll give the explanations there piece by piece. We have seen a decrease in the number of arrests both in the city of Norfolk and throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia over the last few years. I could have spent an hour, and I did at a Democratic committee meeting, spend about 40 minutes just talking about the crime in Virginia stats. One of the major and most interesting takeaways from the crime in Virginia stats was that in 2020 or 2021, we saw a 67% decrease in drug arrests, 2/3 down. And there are 2 major contributing factors to that. Remember, the drug arrests count everything from a shipping container full of fentanyl to an 18-year-old with a dime bag of marijuana. The decriminalization and legalization of marijuana led to a significant drop in marijuana-related arrests, as you can imagine. Though, unfortunately, due to partisan squabbling in the General Assembly, not with the concomitant and necessary establishment of a legal and regulated market. So what we're seeing is a replay of the 1920s, where it wasn't necessarily illegal to drink, but the people who are supplying you with the booze are either committing the crime or, as I all too frequently see, are the victims of crime. Armed home invaders find there no target more ripe than a marijuana dealer, especially if the marijuana dealer happens to be college affiliated. So there was a significant decrease in arrests and jailings for drug offenses in particular, but also, again, most crime in Virginia, outside of triple-digit driving, road rage, domestic assault, aggravated assaults, homicide, most of it was flat or down. And so that is a contributing factor. Another contributing factor is the sheer number of arrests. I can tell you that one of the things that has been particularly difficult and frustrating for me coming in is, as a data-driven guy, getting a hold of our case management system and finding the man hours to have my lawyers put in the data in our system to be able to get good data out. Right now, the deputies are gatekeepers, making sure case by case people make good decisions. And in a business where it's really more art than science, that's most of what we do. One weapons case is not another. But what I can measure and have was the number of felony files that the police department has sent to us, the number of felony arrests. They've dropped by half over the last 4 years. Half. And some of it has to do with the change in what is a crime and what is not, especially around marijuana. Another major change that we saw was to what are called pretextual police stops. The General Assembly, as a matter of policy, was of the opinion that under the Fourth Amendment, the police, whether the police have good or bad intentions, so long as they're not engaging in out-and-out racial profiling, their intentions are irrelevant to whether they are allowed to stop or search an individual or a car. It's simply whether objectively the person has an expectation of privacy. And what that means is that if the police think that their spidey sense tells them that you're toting guns, and that's why they really want to pull you, the fact that they smell marijuana coming from your car, or that you have two of your tail lights out, and that's the basis for their stop, is irrelevant. It's simply, did they have the right to stop you or not? Now, a lot of the criminological research shows that traffic stops are actually pretty dangerous. And the conventional wisdom is that they're very dangerous for police, which they are, but they're actually even more dangerous for motorists. And the General Assembly decided, as a matter of policy, that they wanted to limit the number of traffic stops that Virginia officers were allowed to do. And they removed a whole bunch of traffic offenses, plus the odor of marijuana, as bases under which Virginia officers could stop, and said that a stop on any of those bases, the evidence would be inadmissible in a Virginia courtroom. Now, I can tell you that I've spoken to the police about this. My concern about this law is that the way that I think that the intentions are laudable, I think the practical effect is that it is so easy to circumvent that officers who intend to racially profile can, and officers who make genuine Good Samaritan stops and discover evidence of a crime have no safety valve. The evidence is inadmissible. And that was one of the main discussions that allowed me to convince my predecessor, prior to my taking office, to have a federal prosecutor. Because Richmond can't repeal the Fourth Amendment. They can make their own rules, but I said, we're going to have a stop one day where the stop was for a taillight, and the officer was going to say, I just pulled you over to get your light fixed, and there's going to be a machine gun in the back, or a corpse, and we're going to need to call on the resources of the federal government. So that has played some part in it, and I think that a refinement of that statute that would cover what I consider to be the relatively laudable principles and would actually be more effective would be helpful. But the practical effect is that a lot of people think in reductive or absolute terms, and a lot of officers who I've talked to said, well, I can't pull anybody over, so I'm not going to pull anybody over. And I talk to them, they say, no, that's not the case. And that's not what's coming down from the command level. But it's definitely a perception that we have had to work on. The other major thing that has affected the jail population is a change to how bail is set. One of the things that I wear my voice out about is that as a prosecutor, I both have way more power in some ways and way less power or no power in other ways compared to what even the educated layperson thinks that I can or cannot do. One of the major functions of a prosecutor in, let's say, New York County, Cy Vance or Alvin Bragg, they have an entire intake division in their offices. And that intake division, when a police officer makes a collar, makes an arrest, whether it's day or night, they go in front of the intake division and say, Wills arrests me. Wills comes in and says, I saw Fatehi, go in and assault X. There's a prosecutor who says, wonderful, that's assault and battery, here's the warrant, here's the bail decision, that person's released or held. Or, you know what, not enough information, cut them loose. Or not a danger, release on summons. Every one of those decisional trees does not belong to us in Virginia as prosecutors. It belongs to a system called the magistrate system. They are quasi-judicial officers. They are not required to be lawyers. The requirement is that they have a bachelor's degree. I think the chief magistrate is required to be a lawyer. And based on a lot of push-pull over the last few decades, the current push-pull is that magistrates report to the executive secretary of the Virginia Supreme Court. In decades past, magistrates were appointed by circuit court judges who had some oversight, and there were arguments about that. That lent itself to parochialism and nepotism and abuse and the like, and it was centralized. But the initial bail decision, when somebody, and the initial charging decision that gets made at 2 in the morning on Sunday is made by magistrates. Without prosecutors' input, without prosecutors even knowing about it. And I can tell you, having worked with our magistrates, they want to do a good job. Like, they are very serious about their work, but they don't do what I tell them to do, any more than the police do. The police don't work for me, the magistrates don't work for me, and I don't work for them, for that matter. But what we have seen was that in years past, there was a set of crimes that magistrates had a presumption in favor of releasing on bail, and judges. And then there was a series of crimes where there was a presumption, and magistrates were not allowed to release, absent concurrence from the Commonwealth's attorney. All of those presumptions were repealed a couple of years ago. Again, the principle there is that if we trust somebody enough to be a magistrate, or for that matter, if we trust them enough to be a judge, confirmed by the General Assembly, we should trust them enough to make adult decisions and to know how to apply the law and to weigh flight risk and danger to the community, which are the two factors on which people should be held. Whether they're an unreasonable risk of flight based on what the charge is, and whether they're an unreasonable danger to themselves or others, and based also in part on what the charge is and on their criminal history. Magistrates, when they make those decisions in the middle of the night, they have whatever the officer tells them, wherever Will says about me, and then whatever my criminal history happens to be on the system that they pull up. They do not have further information. And so what we have seen is that I get regular inquiries from members of the community. Why did you let this guy out? I hear you're not into cash bail. Why are you running a revolving door in the Norfolk City jail? And I can tell you, actually, I got an inquiry about a catalytic converter thief from somebody who lived like 15 to 20 miles away from where the crime happened. Why did you let him out? And I pulled the file, and I sent an email back and said, thank you for your inquiry. I literally didn't have a word in this because he was released at 2 in the morning by somebody else. So,
was there a presumption in favor of keeping them locked up before it was repealed?
yes, not for catalytic converters, but for a number of violent offenses.
So you're in Richmond a lot, I take it. Are you asking the General Assembly to put that back in place where there is a presumption in favor of keeping people locked up for those crimes that they're now getting out for and going and recommitting property crimes, car thefts, car break-ins being probably the most numerous around here?
Yeah, which, by the way, all car break-ins, not funded by the General Assembly, because they're practically all misdemeanors. But to answer your question, I'm trying to think of a way that both respects the discretion of people to make adult decisions, because it's like the judges. If judges go rogue, or if they're doing things that are totally inappropriate, do we tie the hands of all judges, good and bad? And that's sort of where the mandatory minimum world came from in the 1990s. Or we hold judges more accountable, unseat them when they do a bad job, and appoint better people. And it's the same question. Is the problem that the presumptions are gone, or is it the problem that magistrates are not applying them? Or is the problem that magistrates need, for example, to get decentralized and go back under the control of the circuit court? I'm open to having the discussion about bringing some presumptions back or bringing some presumptions back situationally. For example, having presumptions in favor, or having presumptions against release at the magistrate level, because whatever you're getting at 2 o'clock in the morning is going to be only a snapshot, but leaving but removing and leaving the presumptions off for judges, where there is going to be a lawyer, a defense lawyer, a prosecutor, and a full hearing on bail, and recognizing the judges both have a law degree and at least theoretically are some of the smartest people in the legal system. So I'm open to the possibility. I also can tell you that having lobbied very heavily for a number of different things in the General Assembly last spring, that it is a multi-year process to have these discussions, and that I, as an individual prosecutor or as the group of prosecutors for whom I lobby sometimes, we have more success going, that's a good idea that's already been germinated, rather than trying to germinate our ideas. One of the few that I continue to try to germinate, there are a number, a wire fraud statute for Virginia to capture high-level financial crime that totally falls through the cracks, but one is a witness protection program. That's one that I continue to lobby for, because we don't have one. But I'm willing to get on board with tinkering with both of those laws to try and make them more effective at what they were trying to get at without having people out. And the final part, that, by the way, that I'd add about jail population, then I'll turn it over, Will, is...
I was going to say we've got time for one or two after this.
Gotcha, absolutely. One of the perverse incentives that the system creates, and one that the prosecutors have actually contracted with the National Center for State Courts to try and fix, is that the number of prosecutors in my office, the number of clerks in circuit court clerks' offices, and the number of deputies assigned to a given locality is practically all driven by felonies. How many felonies? The jail population has a direct impact on number of deputies. The number of felonies that I send to circuit court and that I extract from our population has a direct effect, again, on the number of clerks, number of prosecutors, and I forgot to mention the number of judges. And what that created was a crazy and perverse incentive over the course of the last few decades for prosecutors to charge and pursue felonies, regardless of whether the equities or the public interest or public finances demanded felony convictions, which came with all sorts of barriers to employment, barriers to financial aid and the like, that actually make it more likely for people to reoffend. So one of the dilemmas that I face and that a lot of other people face is, do we seek felonies, knowing that if we don't seek felonies, because in individual cases it's not fair, what are the second order effects going to be? And I think that my ethical duty and my moral duty is that I felonize everybody who deserves to be felonized. I do not felonize people to make sure that my numbers stay up or anybody else's numbers stay up, because we don't sacrifice people like that. Like we don't take individuals and impose significant second and third order offenses on their lives because I'm afraid that I might lose a prosecutor from Richmond. It's just not fair. So there's also sort of that larger piece, which is the unholy incentives that are involved.
When you spoke to us with your two opponents for the primary, I questioned that it didn't sound like any of the three of you were tough on crime. I'm not sure my opinion has changed. I've listened to a lot of, not excuses, I guess, but reasons for why the crime is ongoing, and it's the past few decades of all the mistakes of Americans that have created a lot of this mess. I look back at the previous two administrations in the governor's office, and one of them, I think one alone pardoned over 200,000 felons. They've released, McAuliffe, I think, released people that called strikeout that never had a promise of getting out. In the last 2 or 3 years in the General Assembly, one of our local delegates, and counting Hampton Roads, other co-delegates, senators, were with the governor to help make it so you couldn't pull the car over for the muffler or the lights or the inspection sticker. And is that perhaps why the jail is so empty? Because the little crimes they're kind of just looking away at, and that's why the kids and the thugs and even the older people are coming in. I live downtown. It's turning into I'll say crap hole to be nice, because they know they can get away with it. Is that all the fault of the shortage of police? Is it nothing to do with the prosecutions? Is it nothing to do with the General Assembly? There's a reason all these cells are empty and the people are out on the streets committing their crimes in our neighborhoods. Every single neighborhood here, they're probably getting hit while we're here today, every single day.
Lynn, with the question you had for everybody at
You don't
home
have to
is,
repeat it, by the way. That picks up everything.
okay, all right.
Should have told you that earlier.
That's fine. I'm here to take responsibility for whatever I'm responsible for. But the simple fact is I wouldn't be leveling with you if I weren't talking about these systems level things. And a lot of people who want to point fingers or who want to do these things, the question is, what is their motivation? Like, what is their motivation for pointing the finger?
I've got one point or two. Let me
Sure.
or impolitely
Go ahead.
interrupt. When they tore down the statues downtown, the police, city council, the mayor, everybody stood in agreement. Let them have at it. We did that with Black Lives Matter across America. Nobody got prosecuted. They set fires, they ruined businesses. They did it at a Wawa the other day with a big raid. Is that, why do people not think they can get away with doing these petty crimes? And are the petty crimes maybe more important than the felony convictions?
So what you're asking about the petty crimes and the felonies, that goes back to a theory in the 1990s called broken windows policing and broken windows prosecution. And criminologists have just disproved it. It just doesn't work. It actually creates more problems in the community. And if you listen to NPR last week, I mean, even the chief, Mike Goldsmith acknowledged that. He said that when you go out and you drop the hammer on communities and you write them for having their grass too tall and whether their car's broken up and on blocks in their yard, it actually makes it harder to do the work of suppressing violence and prosecuting violence, because those same people are going to go, well, you could lock my cousin up for this nonsense, but now you want me to come to court and get shot over this homicide? Like, it doesn't work. And I'm happy to give you the data. And if my policies, or if being a progressive prosecutor, which I do not shy away from that label, I am one, and it means being data driven, it means being fair, it means not sacrificing people. So if me and my ilk were the problem, why does Fairfax County have the lowest violent crime rate of any large jurisdiction in the United States? Why do the other jurisdictions, why did Arlington, with 230,000 people and a prosecutor more liberal than me, had 0 murders last year? Nobody talks about this. You tune in Fox News and it's all about progressive prosecutor hellscapes. Well, guess what? Chesa Boudin gets voted out in San Francisco. There's an explosion of violence with the old school prosecutor the mayor handpicked to replace him. There isn't press coverage about that. The facts, unfortunately, are the facts, and part of the responsibility that I have for having the philosophies that I do is constantly answering questions about, well, why aren't your policies turning the world into a hellscape? And the answer is Memphis had a lock-em-up prosecutor for years. Explosion in violence during COVID. Houston, Santa Clara County, the old school prosecutor in California, had one of the highest per capita murder rates in the state. So, we blow a case, I'll come in here and eat it. I make a mistake in my policy, I'll change it. That's a Norfolk Academy thing to do. I hate to go back to Norfolk Academy, but I'm honor bound to eat things, but I can't eat COVID. I can't eat the fact that we're 400 officers down and that there literally aren't enough officers to make arrests, and that the number of cases referred to my office, I'm not talking about the things I did with them. The number of cases referred to my office in the last 4 years is half of what it was. I just got here. It's January. Since January. B, I don't control these other factors. So I'll take responsibility for one of my prosecutors does a bad job. Or if I advocate for a policy that seems not to work. To this day, I'm a no cash bail guy, for example. We talked about that. Because I think that people should either be held in jail without bail or released. If they're a danger, they should be in jail. If they should be released, they should be released. They shouldn't have to pay money because scientifically it doesn't work. But, plenty of people have to pay cash bail in Norfolk because literally every bail decision in Norfolk is either a magistrate's, it's a judge's over my objection, or it's a judge's decision that ratifies my decision. So you're right to ask the question. You're right to put me on the spot about it, but the simple fact is there is a double standard. And you never hear old school lock 'em up, didn't read past Leviticus prosecutors like getting castigated in the media, whether right wing or left wing, for their crime explosions. But you hear about it on when prosecutors want to be more progressive about the work that we do, which every single one of us, to a man or woman, says we want to take our resources and lock up violent people. That's the end result of everything that we want to do.
I've got two. First one's more of a yes or no. And then the second one is kind of about property crimes, which I think everybody would agree are a big problem in Norfolk. So my understanding of the data is that 2-3 years ago, about 60% of felony arrests were certified to circuit court and went forward with felony trials. And now there's fewer felony arrests, but that percentage of felony arrests that are actually certified to circuit court is hovering around 40%. Is that accurate? And if so, why? Is question number one. And then on the property crimes question, I think everybody, no matter what neighborhood you're in, has teams of people roving through their neighborhoods between midnight and 5 in the morning, checking for cars. I leave my car unlocked at my house. There's probably a 90% chance that someone's going to open the doors and pull out whatever I've got in there. And if it's an iPod or an iPhone or something that can be sold, it's going to be sold online. And I don't think that they're doing it themselves. I think they're giving it to people who are then selling it. Organized theft. What is your plan to address that? The numbers I've seen, property crimes are about 4,000 roughly 3 years ago, up to about 6,000 now. And then car thefts, I think, have doubled in the past couple of years. I understand from my police friends that car thefts or stolen cars are involved in most felonies around here. What is your plan to deal with those spikes in crime? And then the felony threshold. Your office has a policy, $2,500 is your threshold. The state is $1,000. Why should somebody stealing $2,400 worth of merchandise not be a felon when the state says you can charge them with a felony of $1,000? So specifically, these spikes in crime and your policies. What is your plan to address these, to bring the numbers down and fix them? And on the threshold, why did you choose 2,500 instead of the state number of 1,000?
Okay. Great question, all three of them. I'm glad you brought them all up because every one of them is something that's got me hot. So your certification numbers. I can tell you, I know who's circulating them. And all the people who are circulating them don't see fit to come and speak to me about them. Which is not helpful, right? Because they either don't know what they're talking about, or they're willfully misinterpreting the data. That information actually got passed to me by a third source because I had to spend a fair number of man hours of my own trying to figure out what all people were talking about, which was time that I then had to take away from doing my job. The certification numbers are not an accurate measure of what's actually happening in court. They may be an accurate measure of what's going up, but it's in raw numbers. And I can tell you that number was 46% last year by whatever that chart is, and was 40% this year. The part of that is a reflection of the fact that we are not messing with the numbers anymore like we used to. The part of that incentive, that felonization incentive, was to send as many indictments up to circuit court as possible, to plump up the numbers in circuit court, to plump up everybody's staffing numbers, including our own. The problem with that is that every single felony certified to circuit court comes with non-waivable court costs. The $400 or $500 a charge, roughly. I'd actually meant to call George's office and ask him what the number was. So what would happen is if the plea at one point had been, for example, plead to 2 and 2 will go away, traditionally what would happen is all 4 would go up, 2 would get all prossed, the person would get jammed with the court costs that are, again, non-waivable. The collection rate on them is at a minimum of 16%, and in Norfolk it's a little bit higher than that. And the end result wound up being the same. Now what we are doing is recognizing that charging people for the stick we used to beat them with, which is what court costs are. They are regressive taxes on the poor that are non-waivable. What we will do is we will extract the penalty that we need to extract out of them. If there needs to be a monetary penalty, it is called a fine, and that a judge can impose in their discretion while taking ability to pay into account. And that we aren't just going to take charges up to circuit court to mess with our numbers. So if it were free, maybe I would do that. But where it loads up indigent people with more money, and the more financially insecure they are, the more likely they are to reoffend, that doesn't work. So that is one of the major factors I can think of. The problem with the numbers is every case is different. How many of those cases are felonies reduced to misdemeanors where we have no witnesses because the witnesses don't want to come to court? How many of them are cases where false statement on a firearm? It's one of the areas where my prosecutors and I actually give a fair bit of deference to the police, to the officers. They're troopers who do it all over Hampton Roads. Mark Walden has been doing this in all the South Side cities for years. And Walden, having seen what other cities do, will occasionally give us recommendations. This one doesn't need to be a felony. It was a tit-for-tat domestic violence situation. She got charged. She didn't know. She's not a felon. Why don't we bust it down in district court? So that may play a part into it, whether it's the equities of the case. It may be, again, nobody's coming. It may be that the victim prefers to have it disposed of because they can't come to court. There are as many explanations as there are theories about it. So, I can't even tell you whether that 46% to 40% is attributable to my policies. So when people use it as some sort of proxy for us not holding people accountable, I don't think that it's an accurate or a fair measure. What I recommend that people look at is what we are able to do with the cases where we have the evidence. Tune in every Friday, multiple press releases about who's getting long sentences here. Last week we had a guy who waited after his custody hearing, was mad about his custody hearing, and ran a woman down, ran down the mother of his children. He pleaded guilty. We agreed to a cap at 20 years. His high end of his guidelines were 13. We asked for 20 and we got 20. We had another case where there was a legitimate self-defense problem. Guy shot 2 guys in the back running away, but it was after somebody broke an entire case of Gatorade over his head on tape. We pleaded that. We got 13 years out of that case. Those cases weren't a matter of where the pleas were the result of a failure of will. They were equitable resolutions that guaranteed a conviction, because the only conviction that's guaranteed in Virginia is a guilty plea. They were signed off on by judges, and we got our sentences. Now, your question about the felony threshold. And actually, I'm really glad you brought that up, John, because that goes back to Glenn's question about why we saw a significant decrease in arrests. There were 2 other adjustments to the property crime laws. One was an increase in the threshold where a misdemeanor becomes a felony. Virginia's threshold up till 4 or 5 years ago was $200. It had been there since the early 1980s, and it had not been raised, and it was the lowest in the entire nation. And other places even have gradations. They have 2 or 3 different gradations of felony, or 2 or 3 different gradations of larceny. Here it's 0 to grand larceny, and grand larceny is, at this point, $1,000 to infinity dollars. So there was a second law in Virginia, the third offense larceny, that said if you stole $2 and convicted, $2 convicted, and another $2 and you were convicted, you're a felon. And at that point, you face up to a 5-year maximum. And that law was repealed under the theory that if you're stealing under the larceny threshold, you can get 12 months to serve. Do the second and third order implications of that offense matter. That was a policy decision made by the General Assembly. The $1,000 threshold puts us relatively firmly, I think, in the middle of the pack nationwide. for what the felony larceny threshold is. Again, acknowledging that there probably should be a second threshold. I tell my prosecutors, if we see a $50,000 loss on an embezzlement, we should be asking for a year, regardless of whether the guidelines call for probation. And when I worked as a financial crimes prosecutor at Chesapeake, that's pretty much what we got: $50,000 a year for every 50 grand. But the reduction or the increase in the threshold and the repeal of the third offense larceny law meant that there are fewer felony arrests being made, fewer felony bail determinations being made, and fewer people being held. The primary benefit of having a low larceny threshold and having third offense larceny was essentially having a prosecutor detailed to those cases. Because again, the General Assembly apparently doesn't think it's worth anybody's time or worth their shelling out money in a year where, by the way, we had a $3 billion surplus. I enjoyed my $500 check when it came this week. Would I have gladly written it off to the Treasury to have 20 more prosecutors, which is what I need? Yeah. So what's my plan for the car break-ins? My plan is to keep on, calling out the Republicans who ran on public safety and won elections on public safety and paid lip service to cities like Norfolk where we're drowning in violence, and say to them, I am getting questions from people on both sides of the aisle about why I don't have prosecutors in court for larceny cases. And my answer is, which murder victim's mother do you want me to say to, I can't, we half-assed your murder case because we're handling car break-ins. The police have to do what the police have to do. I don't control that. They have to have the manpower to focus on car larcenies. I've been to on three different nights this calendar year. I've been to 2 murder scenes.
Is that a Republican issue though? Because it's not something that happened in January that everybody's cars started getting broken into. It's been going on for 4 years at least.
Absolutely
So,
right.
Why is that a Republican issue that we need to yell at them about what's happening under McAuliffe or the Democratic House and Senate?
You're absolutely correct about that. And the answer is that it remains the foundational plank politically. And it was one that was the front and center promise. Public safety, public security, adequate funding for public safety. We had a $3 billion giveaway or a $2 billion giveaway last year, and we're about to have another $1 billion giveaway. Where are the campaign promises? Where are the campaign promises? I'm not above castigating Democrats for not doing it either. But I can tell you that this is a major core issue. Give me the prosecutors to be there. I'm happy to ask the City of Norfolk for them, but I live in the real world. The city's resources are limited. They can't give me everything that I need or that I want. If I start to be involved in every car larceny in Norfolk, which felonies do you want me to start dealing more of? Do you want me to deal more felonies to misdemeanors? Do you want me to start making offers that I don't like making on felonies to free up the bandwidth to have prosecutors dealing with somebody's iPod getting stolen out of their car? I want to be there on those cases. I'm craving being there for both fairness issues and crime suppression issues. I literally don't have the resources. So other than to go into name and shame, I don't have another option. So I don't know if that answers all your questions, but if there's anything I've left out, let me know and I'll answer them.
The short answer would be call our delegates and say, fund prosecutors for misdemeanors.
Yes, and it's very simple. If you wanted the specific ask, the part of the code that says shall prosecute felonies and may prosecute misdemeanors, just cross out and may. Shall prosecute felonies and misdemeanors, and then they are on the hook to fund prosecutors and put them in courtrooms everywhere. Oh, $2,500 threshold. You asked about that. You know who's had a $2,500 informal threshold for at least 15, if not 20 years? Virginia Beach. That's where I got that number from. The city of Virginia Beach, when the larceny threshold was $200, that was under Harvey Bryant, and it continues under Colin Stalin. Has had the idea that $2,500 was right around the number where they the answer starts to become, why shouldn't the person be a felon? And it is not a blanket policy. My policy is extremely dependent on what the facts of the case are, what the person's criminal history is. But it is not simply mechanically the person comes $1,001 in and they're going to be a felon. If you have an IQ of 85, and you have a 10th grade education and you're working at Walmart, and your boyfriend lets you wheel an $1,100 TV out, and you're 19 years old and you don't have a criminal history, how is the felony conviction, on principle, which by the way, the guidelines would call for probation, how is that serving the public interest when it could be a misdemeanor with or without jail? On the other hand, I got a call from a local PTA president, and that PTA president said, I just took office, and I just learned that the PTA president, the previous PTA president, drained $800 out of our account, which is all $800 that we had for our Title I school. Like, if I could make that person a felon, I would, because that is so morally blameworthy. But there is literally no mechanism for me to do that. And I said, I'll devote a prosecutor to it, except I can't, because venue, even though it was a Norfolk school, happened to lie in Virginia Beach. So I made a personal call to my counterpart in Virginia Beach and said, will you assign a prosecutor to this case, because I know you don't normally. And we did. So it is all about measuring criminal history, vulnerability of the victim. If you look at the federal sentencing guidelines, there are all these factors that are considered mitigating and aggravating that float what the penalties should be. And I basically have my deputies instruct the assistants to think along those lines. What is the moral blameworthiness? What does that dollar amount mean? Is it Walmart? Did the guy steal these shoes from underneath his fellow homeless person's head at the Salvation Army? There are times when the dollar amount is totally irrelevant. But the question is, acknowledging that with property crimes, a lot of these folks are not going to jail even if they're convicted of felonies, because the guidelines don't recommend them. And we have one of the highest felony compliance rates, guidelines compliance rates in the state. Are we actually hurting public safety by making it harder for that guy to get a job, just to make some sort of moral point? Or are we helping public safety because at that point we need to restrict their access to guns and restrict their access to these other benefits because they're in actual danger?
All right, last question.
Hey, I just have a point. I don't need a response. So I'm a forensic accountant. I want you to prosecute all the money. But letting somebody steal an $1,100 TV at 19, what does that tell them? So I got my first speeding ticket at 17 or 18. Guess what? I stopped speeding because I had to pay for it. I had to learn a lesson and pay. I mean, letting these people commit crimes, Democrat, Republican, who gives a crap about the political party? You've got to stop it early.
Absolutely, and that person doesn't get a walk. They get a criminal conviction.
But it's okay if they walk out of Walmart because they've never done it before and they're 19. No.
Not at all. They come out with a criminal conviction. They may not come out with a felony. They're going to come out with a criminal conviction.
But that's mostly a misdemeanor. Now, my organization is Retail Alliance, a Merchants Association. So for me to tell my little mom and pop how are they going to make up their profit margins other than shut their doors, they get hammered by $2,400 thieves or organized crime. I can give you statistics. It doesn't work.
I hear you. And the answer there is one of the main ways that I have to actually get restitution for your small businesses and to get nominally indigent people to pay is to offer them a deal good enough that they'll come up with the money in advance, because otherwise they're going to see it $50 or $100 at a time, a month, if that.
It's always on their record.
I'm happy to give it to them. But that is one of the realities. Another one of the realities is if they're in a ring, if it's repeated, it is not mechanical. We don't run an assembly line in my office. Every one of these cases gets assessed on its individual facts.
But these organized crimes, in all due respect, they use young people to go in and do the damage. And when I look at my merchants, they have a very slim margin. They've got a deal right now with labor increases and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're talking about $2,500. I mean, that's their profit, sometimes in a week.
I totally agree. And if this were something that all of a sudden was turning Norfolk into the war of all against all, why is it not in Virginia Beach, where it's been the rule for decades?
Then go down Granby Street and tell me how many retailers are there.
I mean,
0.
I hear you. Having started out life as a white-collar prosecutor, all I want is for the resources to take those smurfs, the individual pawns who are working, and flip them. Yeah, how do I flip them? How do I get them to turn on the person they're selling up the chain? If I just mechanically prosecute every one of them, all I get is pawns. If I want to capture a bishop or a knight or a rook, I have to have something to be able to offer. And having worked as a federal prosecutor, I know how to do this. Now I can talk to you about grand jury reform and why I don't have a grand jury system that exists in the modern world for me to put people in front of a grand jury and swear them and give me information. But that is why it's not cookie cutter justice. It is determined. There are plenty of people who will literally go to jail. If the offer is, you can avoid your felony conviction, but you will go to jail. And somebody sitting in Joe Barron's jail is going to learn a lot more, about life than somebody who gets waved up to circuit court, pleads to a felony, and gets no time. So it is individualized. Like I said, that $800 case, I'd prosecute it as a felony if I could. It is not simply possible. So every one of these cases, I look at individually. And if you really want help on that, I hate to, Linwood's going to call me out for throwing the blame again. But go to your legislators. Have them.
Actually, somebody else called you out on that. But now that you mentioned it, you brought up parties. You said go to our legislators. Our legislators around here are all Democrats. And aren't they the ones that changed it to drop the misdemeanor prosecutions, the Democrats?
Nope.
Nope.
It's been that way forever.
The Republicans have done that.
It's been that way for decades. It probably goes back to the old days of
Democratic legislators in this area would support it. Louise Lucas, whoever else we have around here.
I've been talking to them, and I'm hoping that they will.
You think they will?
I don't know, Linwood. The part of the problem is divided government, and that's why it's got to go in both directions. I think the key difference is that, and the reason that, if you're a murder victim, I don't care what your political party is. If you're a murder defendant, I don't care. I don't care what your political party is. My job is to be fair to everybody regardless of politics. The reason that I speak about this in party political terms is that one party made it the centerpiece of their electoral strategy and gained votes over it. And if that's the case, I think it's only fair for me to say, yeah, everybody's tripped over their feet on this for the last 25 or 50 or 75 years, because it's always been like this. Back up your promises.
You haven't had time? Like you said, you haven't had time.
They've had a whole legislative session. It's literally 3 words.
Right now, I don't think anybody in Norfolk cares what political party you are. They just want the crime to go away. You've been on 2 murders this year. My husband sitting next to me is an 18-year-old Norfolk Fire Rescue. He's probably been on 10 murders since September.
I've been at 2 murder scenes in a single night 3 times. I've probably been to 20 or 25 murder scenes on the low side. I want it to stop too.
Watch the app, and you can watch the retaliation. He's like, oh, so-and-so got shot here. We'll wait 2 more hours, and we'll go back to the next neighborhood and get shot. I mean, I can watch it. I'm an accountant. I don't care about political parties. I just want the crime to stop.
Well, if there were an easy button, I'd be mashing it with both fists. I don't run the police department. I don't run the St. Paul's redevelopment project. I run a group of prosecutors who are dependent on cases to come in, on witnesses to show up in court, on judges to make the right decision, on jurors to make the right decision. So I'm doing what I can, and this is technical work. It is technical. There's art in it, not just science. If there were an easy button, I would push it, and if there were an easy button, prosecutors of all different political stripes would have been jumping up and down on it with both feet, as they're dealing with their own violence problems. We are, one part of the system, and the part of the system that I control. But if I can make murders go away, I would.
All right, thank you guys. Thank you, Ramin. Thank you very much for this. Everybody will be back next month. Thank you all for coming, and look forward to seeing you then.